From North Korea to Syria, from a nuclear deal with Iran to a climate change agreement in Paris, from ISIS to Jerusalem, Donald Trump has transformed American foreign policy dramatically in 1 year. We'll talk about it on The Uprising.
LibertyNation.com. They're the resistance, but we are the uprising. With Scott Cosenza and Tim Donner.
There's not going to be a President Donald Trump.
Hey, a president! Can you believe it?
I love the poorly educated.
The voters have guaranteed themselves slavery, economic disaster.
I can't believe I'm losing to this guy.
You could put half of Trump's supporters into what I call the basket of deplorables.
I have never met with Russians.
Our elected representatives can abuse subordinates and then secretly use a slush fund of our money to pay them off.
Black Lives Matter, the Antifa movement, is interested in preserving the fabric of America.
Well, as he returns from the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland, after serving as the salesman for America, Donald Trump has completed a first year of foreign policy that stands in sharp contrast to his predecessor, Barack Obama, and George W. Bush, for that matter. Dramatic change in policy toward North Korea, no more strategic patience. Bombing Syria after they employed chemical weapons, calling out Iran on Obama's dubious nuclear deal, calling out NATO and demanding they pay their fair share for American protection, pulling out of the Paris Climate Accord, just saying no to the TPP, Trans-Pacific Partnership, finally recognizing Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, vanquishing the ISIS caliphate. Whew. It's been just as busy a first year in foreign policy as it has been on the domestic front for the 45th president. And here to evaluate Trump's performance on international matters is Mark Angelides, UK editor and our man on the ground in London for LibertyNation.com. Welcome, Mark.
Hi, Tim. Thanks for having me.
My pleasure, and I appreciate it. So of all the things I listed, Mark, which would you rate as the most important so far in the Trump foreign policy, and why?
Well, in terms of what the most important element is of his foreign policy, it's got to be his forcefulness. I mean, he's clearly saying that the same thing at home as he is abroad, which is very different to other presidents where they've had a domestic market and a foreign market, and they've often talked at cross purposes for each one. But you and I have talked before about the Jacksonian foreign policy that Trump's been pursuing, and I really think that it wasn't quite on the Jacksonian scale, but I think possibly the best example of what he's done so far is, as you mentioned, dealing with Bashar al-Assad. It's such a contrast to what happened under Barack Obama, where his famous red lines that kept being redrawn again and again, which had a major negative impact on America's world image. But I think it was in April, was it? And Trump stood up and said, you're not going to use nerve gas, not on children, not on women. And then swiftly in retaliation launched, I think it was 59 cruise missiles at that Syrian airfield. He really did show the whole world that when he draws a line, he sticks to it. Since then, obviously, Assad's gone nowhere near any chemical weapons as far as we know. So I think that the key element for his foreign policy has been his forcefulness and his willingness to follow through with exactly what he says he's going to do.
Well, when he campaigned for the presidency and as he entered the White House, Trump was depicted by the media and also by neoconservative hawks in his own party as an isolationist who would pull America into a cocoon. What has he done to either live up to or defy that expectation?
Well, actually, this is quite a popular idea that gets put forth by globalists, that if you're not involved governmentally, internationally, you're an isolationist. It's utter nonsense, of course. It's an idea put forward by people who want nation-state governments under the control of supranational organizations, like the European Union, for example, where there's unelected and unaccountable people. And they're really fighting a narrative war to convince people like you and I, regular folk, that to not join in with this thing is isolationist. So Trump, he's going out there and he's getting deals with other countries, but these are purely trade deals. There's no sacrifice of sovereignty or control, which a lot of these deals have at their root, like as you mentioned, the TTP and the TTIP, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership. These things are a sacrifice of sovereignty in some ways. So when we say, is Trump an isolationist? Is he pulling America into a cocoon? No, he's really not. He's just doing what's best for America by protecting not only American jobs, but by pulling back companies to America. And at the same time, he's creating an international image for America among the world where people are wanting to go in and put money into America. They're wanting to reopen their factories and their office headquarters there. This is not isolationist, it's competitive.
Yes, he's made a point of distinguishing between the idea of America first and America alone. He did that in Davos and in the run-up to Davos.
Absolutely. Yep.
Now,
that's exactly right.
Now, so after going to Davos, where his America First policies were expected to meet global resistance, but didn't for the most part. I mean, to what to what extent are other countries either defying or imitating the tax-cutting, deregulatory environment being created by Trump and the GOP back in the old USA?
Well, here's the thing. There are, in most countries that have a parliamentary system or like a presidential system, that there's always more than one party. In many cases, often 2, 3, or 4 that have some kind of electoral sway. And what we're finding is that the insurgent parties in many of these countries are pushing for a very, very similar tax plan, cutting corporation tax to make the countries much more competitive against other neighboring nations. In fact, I think was it the Washington Post, for my sins, they perfectly put it ahead when they said about what the leading parties are after. They wrote something along the lines of that the tax bill was an atrocity, and they bemoaned the fact that countries used to coordinate their taxes to make a level playing field in economics. But when you're the world's top economy, a level playing field means that you're going down and not up.
Right.
Which is clearly the level playing field is great for everybody else, but not so good for America. And I do hate to mention globalists twice in one show, but the idea that a country can be economically equally attractive to a place with lower tax rates, it's a myth. It's one that's supported by the globalist outlook, that they want an agreed upon even tax rate. So political parties that are quite often not in power, but will be coming forward, they're still riding this Trump wave and this Brexit wave. And they're seeking to put their countries first, lower taxes, lower corporate tax or corporation tax, we call it over here, to make the countries not offshore tax havens as such, but a place that's just attractive for go-getters who want to actually do business on a world stage, but don't want to be punished for making money. And I mean, we've seen in America how good it is for the actual individual, the people on the street who are working in these companies, who thought they were stuck with, this is my wage and this is all I'm getting and this is all I'm likely to get. And they're getting $1,000 bonuses. I mean, the minimum wage thing, which is debatable about how good or bad it is, but when it's set by the corporation, they're saying we're going to up.
That's a very different thing than a government established minimum wage law within individual states. As we continue with Mark Angelides, our UK editor at LibertyNation.com, and enjoy the protestations of his canine companion, let's switch over to the issue of North Korea. Now, do you think, Mark, that the decision by North and South Korea to sort of hold hands and sing Kumbaya during the upcoming Olympics in South Korea, marching under the same banner and fielding a joint women's hockey team, makes things easier or harder for the president in his aggressive stance towards Kim Jong-un and the North Korean nuclear threat?
Well, contrary to popular opinion, I actually think that this North and South Korea thing is actually a Trump victory. I mean, for years we've had no cooperation, no movement towards reconciliation. Then Trump comes along, lets Kim Jong-un know that Obama's policy of strategic indifference, I guess.
Strategic patience. Yes. Yeah.
I think indifference probably works better.
That's probably true. Yes.
Yeah. That this whole policy is over, and all of a sudden, what we've got is movement, and it really looks like the beginning of international engagement for North Korea, which is wonderful. I mean, it may well be a power play by Kim to try and destabilize the relationships that Donald Trump's been building up around that area, especially on his grand tour. But I mean, operators like Japan's Shinzo Abe, they're far too smart to fall for this kind of thing. And there's a lot of tension between them anyway. And I think that Donald Trump being involved has actually brought this situation forward. I mean, it really does look like North Korea is on the verge of getting back into international relations. And that can't be a bad thing. And we have to be completely honest here. This would not have happened. It just wouldn't have happened without Trump putting forward his very special brand of diplomacy. It just wouldn't have happened.
Very special brand, yes. I would term it that way.
Yeah.
Now, let's go back to trade for a minute, because, of course, even conservatives who are, left with no choice but to agree that this president has been the most conservative president since Ronald Reagan, through his policy, through his cabinet appointments, perhaps even more conservative than Reagan in the end. One area where they find true disagreement is in what's called so-called free trade, and they criticize him for wanting to renegotiate or pull out of NAFTA. Some of them even TPP. Even some Republicans, globalist Republicans, have supported that. But there seems to be a broad misunderstanding about free trade, fair trade, and the whole deal. I mean, it seems to me, and tell me if I'm wrong here, that what Trump is saying is, I want free trade and I want fair trade, but we're going to get better deals if we make bilateral agreements with each individual country than if we inherently have to give up all that one has to give up when one is in a coalition of 15, 20, 25, 30 nations. I mean, isn't this the truth, that he believes he can just get better deals on a bilateral basis rather than rejecting, as so many have said he has, rather than just rejecting the whole concept of free trade?
You know what? That is absolutely right. The person I think who put this best of all was Sebastian Gorka, when we did an interview with him here on Liberty Nation. And he was expanding on the idea that free trade agreements are not natural things. That they're not the way that all countries do business. In fact, they're quite a rarity. What the standard deal is, what's really made global trade work over the centuries, has been bilateral agreements. It's been one country saying to another country, this is what I need, what do you need for this to work? And that they're coming up with this thing. Now, what happens then is when they move on to another country, to another deal, they say, okay, so this is my position. This is what I can do. This is what I can't do. And then they're building on top of these. So although the trade agreements all overlap each other, they are all individual agreements. So if for example, one of those countries needed to pull out of one of those agreements because they felt a better deal elsewhere, the whole thing doesn't collapse. It just means this one part of the deal, one specific deal, needs to be renegotiated. And what it allows is actual freedom. And the best part is that it doesn't need to be orchestrated by global organizations, which many of these are, like corporatism. It's quite a dirty word in my neck of the woods, crony corporatism.
It is here too, Mark, believe me, yes.
What happens is that many on the political left, that they conflate crony corporatism with capitalism. And the two things couldn't be further opposites. It's quite crazy how this has become conflated in modern parlance. So what's happening is when we have Trump going after bilateral trade agreements, what he's looking for is the best in every possible situation.
Right.
Instead of, here are the compromises I need to make to get all 15 other countries on board. You don't need to do this when you're doing bilateral. All you have to do is say, this is what I'm willing to give, and this is what I'm willing to take.
I mean, an example of this, Mark, is the North American Free Trade Agreement.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, Canada and Mexico, which are parties to the agreement, are very, very different nations. We actually run, when you include services in it, we run a surplus with Canada, a deficit with Mexico. But why should we have to pass a watered-down deal that's the lowest common denominator between Canada, Mexico, and the U.S., rather than making what we should make, which is a separate deal with Canada than with Mexico, which is a very different country than Canada?
That's absolutely right. In fact, the only reason for America staying in NAFTA, the United States staying in NAFTA, is to make trade easier between Canada and Mexico. I really see no other purpose of that. I think you're kind of stuck in it because of your geographic position. If both were on a southern border, for example, if Canada were on a southern border and right next door to that was Mexico on the southern border, there would be no need for the U.S. to be in NAFTA. It's just utterly irrelevant. I mean, you can have free trade agreements or trade agreements, bilateral agreements with Canada, and you can have bilateral agreements with Mexico. The only reason to have the cooperation of NAFTA is that it makes it easier for Mexico and Canada to deal together. So you're in a geographic stitch up there, my friend.
It's true. Although you've got the entire continent beneath you, and you've got and you had a whole lot of challenges with the European Union and the vengeance that they are taking on England for having the audacity to pull out of the EU. But let's close with this question, Mark.
Please.
If you could pick the most underrated, for better or worse, element of Trump's foreign policy over the first year, the most underrated element, what would it be?
It's a tough question. I mean, his work on destroying ISIS is huge, but I think most people acknowledge that. And obviously, moving forward, recognizing Jerusalem's a big one. But if I can make a prediction, if you don't mind.
You're fire away.
All right. I would guess that building a relationship with the Saudi Crown Prince, Mohammed bin Salman, I think that's going to turn out to be probably the biggest thing that happens foreign policy, at least for this first year. I mean, the country has an appalling human rights record. But when MBS, as he's known, when he comes to power eventually, which he will, I get the feeling that the transformation in the country will be like nothing we've seen before in that area. I mean, it is just a prediction, but I think we'll see a move to a far more democratic way of life, an enforcement of rights for women, and a much more secular society coming out. It's not definite, of course, but I think that Trump's influence here and the relationship that he's built really might help the Saudis move forward in this.
Thank you, Mark.
Very welcome, Tim.
Mark Angelides, UK editor for LibertyNation.com. I'm Tim Donner, and this is The Uprising, the podcast of LibertyNation.com.